Much better. Let me see. Yo, that was unbelievable, not gonna lie, Jesus Christ. Alright, let's see what's on YouTube today. Oh god. What the hell did Simpson post? Okay, I'm getting called out. Okay, just had to add that comment. Ooh. Oh my god, I see it again. Oh my god, Postman action video.
Australia is home to some of the deadliest. Australia is home to some of the deadliest animals on the planet.
Amen, brother.
You, there's one creature they all fear. An invasive species, millions strong, wiping out native animals that we are locked in combat with to this very day. What kind of vile beast is capable of spreading such reckless hate? The answer is this fat fucking toad. But how did this war begin? Well, to answer your question, we're going to have to go way back. The year is 1866. We are in the land down under, and our story begins the same way many tragedies do, with the British. You see, having gone hippity-hoppity, your ancestral home is now my property around 90 years back, the Brits were in full swing, rampantly colonising the country. And part of that included agriculture. Now, they brought with them many crops, but the important one in this story is sugarcane. Sugar is valuable, not only for trade, but also because, well, the fucking tea isn't going to sweeten itself, is it?
Cool.
But you see, sugarcane only grows in the heat, which ruled out the south of the country. It also likes humid environments, which ruled out Western Australia, which left them with one option. And so, the cane farmers loaded up their first Stardew Valley save in Queensland in 1866. But the farmers ran into an issue. You see, Queensland is home to these nifty little bugs called Dermalopida albahertum. These are native beetles that hit their macros by munching on plant leaves. So when cane farmers joined the Queensland Minecraft server and set up a fucking Hermitcraft-sized farm, the beetles were in heaven and set to work demolishing the plant leaves. Now, funnily enough, the adult bugs weren't actually the problem. Sugarcane leaves hold full value. But the problem is that with such an abundant food source, the bugs started multiplying, laying their eggs around the base of the plants. These eggs hatched into larvae. And unlike the grown-ups, these little worms don't eat the leaves. They eat the roots. And so the sugarcane starts getting absolutely fucking spit roasted. And the farmers can do nothing but watch as sugarcane yield plummets through the floor along with their profits. This whole situation really pissed off the farmers, who banded together, went to the Australian government, and told them to fucking fix it. Sir, a horde of creatures is destroying the cane fields. And so the Queensland government founded the Bureau of Sugar Experimentation Stations, or the BSES, in 1900. This team of crack scientists then immediately set out trying to solve the very same issue every single Factorio player faces. This place is covered in bugs. They are breaking my shit. How do I violently slaughter the local wildlife in order to expand capitalism and my profit margins? The BSES pondered this question for 25 fucking years. They tried spraying chemical insecticides. Didn't work. They tried injecting insecticides into the soil. Didn't work. They tried releasing the fucking cordyceps fungus. And it still didn't work. Then, one day in the office, while pondering this question, someone had an idea.
Oh god.
Okay, we are getting outmaneuvered by the cast of Bugs Life. Someone in this office, please give me anything. What about cane toads? What? Cane toads. Those big fucking fat things that exist in the cane fields in Hawaii. I mean, it's a frog. They eat bugs. We just introduce an invasive species to fix a problem caused by an invasive species. I mean, what could possibly go wrong?
Oh god. Yep.
And so, in June of 1936, 2,400 brave cane divers were deployed to the fields to deal with the arthropod menace. But there's just one small issue. Cane toads were fucking dog shit. Yeah, funnily enough, big, fat, slow, ground-dwelling toads were not exactly the smartest solution to deal with beetles that spend the majority of their adult life 6 meters off the fucking ground.
It's over, Anakin! I have the high ground!
On top of that, cane toads don't dig for food either, so they didn't eat the larvae. Now, this all sounds like information that should have come up during the research and study phase of the plan. This, however, implies that there was a research and study phase.
Ain't no
the
way,
BSCS did not conduct a single fucking study on environmental impact, but
Wait, we'll go back. What the fuck?
a single fucking study on
Ecosystem
environmental impact before releasing an army of cane toads. Are you fuck? This complete absence of brain cells caused a rather spectacular domino effect of ecological f***ups, and it's going to teach you a valuable lesson about invasive species. You see, while the cane toads barely ate what they were supposed to, they did eat. And as incredibly large omnivorous toads, they ate practically anything they could fit into their mouths. Rats, mice,
lizards,
snails, baby birds. It was the toad equivalent of f***ing Kirby. And then, not unlike the exact problem they were brought here to solve,
one often meets destiny on the path to take
with all that food, they started reproducing. A lot. In fact, female cane toads can lay anywhere between 8,000 to 30,000 fucking eggs per clutch. But I mean, this should not be too much of a problem. Australia is home to some of the deadliest creatures on the planet. Surely, the local wildlife has this under control. Wait, what? Yeah, cane toads are poisonous. So those little bulges on the shoulder, those are parotoid glands, and they are packed to the brim with bufotoxin. No,
what, not neurotoxin?
Not a D's nuts joke. Got him! Now, whenever the adult toads are threatened, they will squirt this white, sticky fluid out of the glands. And when ingested, it does two things. One, makes you trip absolute balls thanks to the hallucinogenic bufotenin. And two, the other ingredient, bufogen, just straight up gives you a fucking heart attack.
Damn.
It's important to note that this toxin is also present in their eggs and tadpoles. Now, in their natural habitat, this isn't as much of a problem because everything around them has had thousands of years to get good and deal with this fuck-ass poison build by either developing immunity or learning to eat around the glands. But Australia is not their ecosystem, and despite all of the deadly animals we've got, they have had a grand total of 5 minutes to adapt to the presence of the fucking calid toad. Now, quick question for the class. What happens to an animal population when there is nothing to eat it? It gets bigger. And so, there is nothing to eat it. It gets bigger.
I'm gonna start spawning toads, you fuckwit.
And so, shortly after being introduced, a rapidly expanding tyrannid swarm of toads began to spread across the country. The BSCS noticed this and did fucking nothing, because it technically didn't affect the sugar cane. The swarm spread further, occupying all inhabitable parts of Queensland, and they were laying so many fucking eggs that their clutches began polluting the waterways like a bufotoxin teabag, killing native fish as well as any animals that drank from the water. The BSCS did nothing. Those eggs hatched into tadpoles, which started killing more fish. The BSCS still did nothing. The swarm had advanced, breaching into the Northern Territory and New South Wales. When questioned, the BSES insisted the toads were doing their jobs and everything was fine. By the 1980s, the toads were now starving out or just fucking eating local wildlife and one-shotting anything that tried to eat them. And considering at this point there were 5 fucking million of them, that happened a lot. So with local wildlife being absolutely fucking decimated, the BSES was forced to acknowledge that maybe, just maybe,
Listen, we fucked up.
But, oh well, everyone makes mistakes. Nothing we can do about it. No! They left it for the government to clean up. Sir, a second horde of creatures has escaped the cane field. Fuck! Yeah, they realised just how much damage was being done and in 1986 began funneling federal funds into controlling the population. They tried trapping and physically removing the toads, but unless they had 5 million traps, that wasn't going to do shit. Biological warfare was proposed in the form of releasing viruses and parasites, but was shot down because it would do just as much damage to the native wildlife. And so, the toad front continues to advance to this day. So where does that leave us? Short answer is kind of fucked. Cane toads now threaten a total of 75 native species, and they've even driven populations of animals like the northern quoll to complete extinction in parts of the country they infest. And with the population now sitting at 200 fucking million toads, infestation is spreading, with predictions showing they will be fucking up ecosystems in 5 states in the near future. And given that they have amassed a population 10 times the size of the humans in Australia, the government has completely fucking abandoned the fight for eradication, switching focus to harm reduction, using bait toads covered in non-lethal but unpleasant substances to try to teach local wildlife that toad bad. On top of this, the government has encouraged the broader public to, just fucking kill the toads. You are supposed to do it humanely by catching them and sticking them in a freezer for 48 hours, but, most people don't want a frog taking up their freezer space, so they just use a golf club or a car.
Driving in my car right out.
Oh my god!
And with this being Australia, our wildlife is also putting up a fight. Keelback snakes, for example, are immune to their venom, and Ricali and magpies have learned to flip them onto their backs before getting a feed. Now, jokes aside, you want to know who I feel genuinely f***ing awful for? The toads. They didn't ask for any of this shit. They just got dumped onto a random island and did their thing, and now they are being actively hunted. No. The assholes in this story are the BSES and the cane growers. Because you may be thinking, why were they allowed to do this shit in the first place? Well, that's the neat part. They weren't. The federal government banned the f***ing idea when they came up for it in 1935, based on the advice of entomologists who rightly presumed the toads would become...
This great toad, immune from enemies, omnivorous in its habitats, and breeding all year round, may become as great as a pest as the rabbit.
A bigger fucking issue than the beetles. But the BSES and the cane growers lobbied to have the ban lifted in 1936. We are stuck in permanent toad combat.
Suffering builds character. Suffering builds character. Suffering builds character.
Because these dickheads looked at scientific advice and went, nah-uh. You have got to be fucked. G'day, Merry Christmas, Happy Holidays.
27.
Alright. Oh shit. Nothing in life is to be feared, it is only to be understood. Now is the time to understand more, so that we may feel less. Mary Curie.
How can a Boeing 777, one of the biggest and most modern aircraft in the world, just vanish without a trace? It can't. Everything lost leaves a trace.
Oh my god, it's probably one of the most...
At a Malaysia Airlines flight with 239 people on board.
MH370.
Flight 370.
Flight MH370.
There are
what did I say?
370.
Flight MH370.
Well, I said the flight you heard new victims leaving that night. Oh god.
There are mysteries in the world, and then there is the story of MH370. This is a story so full of questions and theories that it's almost impossible to tell it without resorting to pure speculation. This is the reason I have refrained from covering it up until now, but since at the time of this video's release it's gone 10 years since 239 people disappeared without a trace, I've decided to make an exception. This story is created with one goal and one goal only, and that is to persuade the authorities to restart the search for the missing Boeing 777. And with that, hopefully also provide some closure to the families, some of which I've been in contact with before making this video. I will today share with you new potential evidence based partially on a technology that has been enhanced and refined over the last few years, to the point where it now possibly can provide new clues to where this aircraft finally ended up. This is the story of Malaysian Airlines Flight 370, as far as we know it.
A New Hope.
Good night, Malaysia, 370.
On the 7th of March 2014, a crew from Malaysian Airlines checked in for a night duty which was to take them from Kuala Lumpur International Airport in Malaysia up to Beijing International in China. Except for the late start time, it was supposed to be a quite nice duty with a calculated flight time of only 5 hours and 34 minutes, meaning that they would eventually be finished in Beijing around mid-morning the following day. The captain of the flight arrived first and signed in at the Malaysian Airlines crew room at local time 22:50. He was then followed by his colleague, the first officer, around 25 minutes later. This was planned as a training flight for the first officer, since he was completing a transition type course over from the Airbus A330 to the Boeing 777, which they would be flying on this flight. The training had gone really well up until this point, and if everything went fine on this flight, he would be recommended for final line check by the captain for the following duty. Having said that, this was the first time that these two pilots were planned to fly together, which might explain why the captain had turned up a little bit earlier. You see, it's pretty common for us instructors to do so if we need to review someone's training file, for example, before the flights, to check out if there's any areas that might require special attention. In any case, once the first officer had also signed in, the two pilots proceeded by going through the pre-flight briefing, which from what they could see looked pretty straightforward. The weather in Kuala Lumpur was generally nice and dominated by a subtropical high pressure centered over Thailand, and the weather at their destination Beijing also looked quite good from what they could see. The only potential issue was that about 2/3 down the route they would be passing through a pretty strong jet stream with high winds, which could cause a bit of turbulence, but apart from that it was looking pretty straightforward. With that in mind, and no NOTAMs affecting the flight either, the pilots then turned their attention to the flight plan. There were two alternates listed for Beijing, and taking into consideration both of these, the pilots decided on a final fuel of 49,100 kilos, which was in line with the expected amount for this flight, neither substantially more nor less than required. This fuel would give the aircraft an approximate endurance of 7 hours and 31 minutes, around 2 hours longer than the anticipated flight time, and that will of course become very important in this story.
Yep.
So who were the pilots that were going to be in charge of this flight then? Well, the captain was a 53-year-old with a 33-year great track record in Malaysia Airlines. He was married with 3 children, and on his spare time he was involved in the local opposition party, helped deliver groceries.
Wait, hold on, I want to read this. Captain Zahari Ahmad Shah, 53 years old, the pilot in command, was born in the island of Penang. He completed his Malaysian Certificate of Education (MCE), equivalent of the United Kingdom Ordinary (UK O-level), uh, at the Penang Free School, where he sat for his MCE examination in 1978. In 1981, he was accepted as a cadet pilot with MAS under the sponsorship of Malis Amana Rakyat, probably mispronounced that, or Mala, a People's Trust Council of the Malaysian government. Interesting.
To elderly and tinker with some home electronics. He had also started a YouTube channel, which, by the way, is still there, where he showed how to mend certain home appliances, and also, crucially, where he showed off his home simulator, which he had built to be able to practice his trade at home. This simulator would later be investigated thoroughly. It had been erased weeks before the flight, but the investigators still found some manually entered waypoints of interest in a backup memory, but without it proving to be anything conclusive. In any case, the captain had stable finances, no known illnesses, and was regarded as a solid, reliable member of his community. In terms of his aviation career, it had started when he was accepted into a sponsored program for Malaysian Airlines already back in 1981. He completed his licenses and then started flying for them back in 1983. He then worked his way up the ranks, starting on the Fokker F-27 and then the 737-200, Airbus A300, and finally he got his first command on the Fokker 50. This was then followed by command on the 737-400 and the Airbus A330 until actually on my birthday, the 22nd of September 1998, he received his command on the Boeing 777, which he then continued to operate until the day of this flight. His good track record and seniority eventually gave him the opportunity to also become a type rating instructor as well as an examiner on this type, and it was in this capacity that he was going to operate Malaysian Airlines Flight 370 on this evening. He had a total experience of just over 18,400 hours, and 8,659 of those had been flown on the Boeing 777. The first officer was 27 years old and single. He had also been accepted into the airline as a cadet pilot, started in 2008.
Right. First Officer Farik Abdul Hamid, accepted as a MAS cadet pilot and completed his flying training at the Langkawi Aerospace Training Center, Langkawi, in 2008. His first fleet posting was on a Boeing 737-400 as second officer or flight engineer. Wait, there's a flight engineer on this Boeing 737? I didn't know that. I never knew that Boeing 737 had a flight engineer part. You learn something new every day, I guess. Until May 2010. He was promoted to first officer in May 2010, and he was on the fleet until August 2012. Between 2012 and to November 2013, he was promoted to the A330-300 and the Boeing 777-200.
And he'd been flying initially on the Boeing 737-400. He had then changed over to the Airbus A330 fleet in 2012 and then onto the Boeing 777 in November 2013, just a few months before this flight. And this was obviously why he was still in training. He had a total experience of just over 2,800 hours and very little, only 39 hours on the type. There is not much more mentioned about the first officer in the final report, except that he was known as a nice person with stable economy and no recent major changes in his life. Now, given the vast difference in experience, seniority, and the fact that this was a training flight, it can be easily assumed that the power gradient in the cockpit would have been quite steep, but nothing indicated any personal issues between these two colleagues. Both of them had also received more than the required rest before the flight, and their licenses and medicals were all up to date.
That's also good.
When the pilots had completed their pre-flight preparation and training briefing, they walked over to their 10 cabin crew members that they were scheduled to operate together with. This was a vastly experienced crew with the most junior attendance.
Alright, let me read this. In-flight supervisor IFS, male, 55 years old, 35 years of experience. Chief stewardess CS, male, 49 years old, 25 years of experience. Where did my Seribot thing go? Anyways, so Chief Stewardess, CSS, female, 49 years old, 24 years of experience. Leading Steward, LS, male, 42 years old, 19 years of experience. Leading Stewardess, LSS, female, 42 years old, 22 years of experience. Flight Stewardess, FSS1, female, 42 years old, 20 years of experience. Flight Stewardess 2, female, 39 years old, 18 years of experience. Flight Steward FS1, male, 46 years old, 18 years of experience. 9. Flight Steward FS2, male, 41 years old, 17 years of experience. Flight Steward FS3, male, 44 years old, 13 years. That's insane.
And having flown for 13 years and the most senior over 35 years, so the briefing would have been pretty quick and efficient. After they were finished, they all walked together out to the aircraft that was being prepared for them by the ground crew outside. It was a majestic Boeing 777-200ER equipped with 2 Rolls-Royce Trent 892 Bravo turbofan engines, and
nice.
It was in perfect working condition according to the tech log. The only point of interest was that the flight crew oxygen cylinder had been topped up just prior to the flight, but this was a routine maintenance thing.
Okay.
Now, there are numerous systems aboard this aircraft that will become important for this story, and in order to explain it, I will have to become quite technical in some places, but also that's kind of what we do here on the channel.
True.
Anyway, the 2 pilots had decided that the first officer was going to be pilot flying for this flight, meaning that he immediately started completing the pre-flight preparation as soon as he arrived to the cockpit.
Nice and
This
early.
included inputting flight information like the flight number and the airline info into the FMC CDU, which he did at time 23:56 and 8 seconds. Now you might wonder how we can know that so exactly, and this has to do with the system. Now you might wonder how we can know that so exactly, and this has to do with the system that will play an incredibly important role here, the Aircraft Communications Addressing and Reporting System, more commonly referred to as ACARS. This is a digital data link system which connects data providers on the ground directly to the aircraft via either VHF or satellite communications. It enables people on the ground to send things like updated weather, flight plans, and even make calls or send messages directly to the aircraft.
Yo, so you mean I can have a Discord call with my plane?
When it's airborne, and the part of this system which is going to be most important here is the satellite communications, or SATCOM system. The ACAR system booted up and established a link through the SATCOM at time 23:54, and about 1 minute and 20 seconds later, it captured the first officer's inputs, as I just mentioned before. This showed that the system worked fine in the beginning of this flight, and it's worth noting here that the system uses 2 different satellite antennas depending on if the aircraft's navigation system is working or not. Remember that. Anyway, as the first officer was working away in the cockpit, he soon received an ACARS message containing something known as a NOTOC. Frequent viewers of this channel will know that this stands for Notification to Captain and is normally sent out if the aircraft will be carrying dangerous goods. In this case, there were actually no dangerous goods on board, just some special load being loaded consisting of several tons of mangosteens, which apparently had a tendency to leak juice and water and therefore had to be checked closely. The NOTOC message confirmed that the cargo had been checked and that it wasn't leaking, but what it didn't say was that there was also nearly 2.5 tons of lithium-ion batteries loaded on board.
Oh, damn!
But these batteries were individually packaged and stored in such a way that they were not considered dangerous goods, and they have therefore been ruled out as a possible cause for what's about to happen. Eventually, the captain returned from his walk-around and together with his colleague, they completed the rest of the pre-flight preparations and briefings. And at time 23:25, the first officer called up Kuala Lumpur delivery to request their departure clearance.
Delivery Malaysia 370, good morning.
The delivery controller told them that they were cleared to follow the PBOS 1 Alpha departure from runway 32 right and initially climb to 6,000 feet with transponder code 2157.
Malaysia 370 is cleared to Beijing via PBOS Alpha departure, 6,000 feet, squawk 2157.
This was read back by the first officer, and less than 2 minutes later, Malaysia 370 also requested push and start, which was almost immediately approved.
Tiger Malaysia 370, good morning. 21, requesting push and start. Good morning, push back and start to runway 3 to right, exit via Sierra 4. Push back start to right, exit Sierra 4, TLP 239 Mike Romeo Oscar. Copy.
After the pushback, the aircraft received its taxi clearance and then started taxiing out towards runway 32 right through the dark Malaysian night. And for anyone watching the aircraft, everything looked completely normal, but this was going to be the last time anyone saw this aircraft with their own eyes. So what about the passengers then? Well, there were 227 passengers on board, coming from 14 different nations. 153 were from China, making those the largest group, followed by 50 from Malaysia and 7 from Indonesia. 2 of those passengers were later found to have been flying on stolen passports, and they were identified as Iranians who were most likely looking for refugee status and were not considered a threat.
Okay, good.
None of the other passengers raised any type of suspicion, and this means that in total there were 239 passengers and crew on board when the giant Boeing 777 lined up on runway 32 right and started spooling up its engines. And I'll tell you all about what happened next, right after this. And inclusive 6 Malaysian Airlines discount off the annual plan. Thank you, Incogni. Now let's continue. At 40 minutes and 37 seconds past midnight on the 8th of March, Kuala Lumpur Tower cleared Malaysian Airlines flight 370 for takeoff.
370, 32 right of takeoff. Nice. 32 right of takeoff, Malaysia 37, thank you.
The first officer was at the controls at this point and had therefore handed over the radio to the captain, and after the engines were stabilized, he pushed the toga buttons and the aircraft started accelerating down the runway. At 42 minutes past midnight, the SATCOM system recorded that the aircraft was airborne, and it then continued to transmit the aircraft's identification codes together with all of the other normal data, and this just showed that everything was completely normal at that stage. The procedures in Kuala Lumpur was for the pilots to automatically switch over to the departure frequency after takeoff, so that's exactly what the captain now also did. Once he called up and identified himself, the departure controller told them to cancel the standard instrument departure and instead proceed direct towards a waypoint called Igari and continue the climb to flight level 180. That's pretty cool.
Jesus Christ, give me a second. So I
Common
don't
that controllers give clearances like this, especially at night when there's typically less traffic and therefore easier to give these kind of directs. The captain just read back the clearance and then selected Igari as the active waypoint in the FMC. The first officer would have then verified it, told him to execute the routing, and then selected flight level 180 in the mode control panel for the captain to verify, just like they would have done thousands of times before. At this stage of the flight, everything was still completely normal, and when you listen to the ATC tapes, the voice level of the captain is completely relaxed and routine. The aircraft continued its climb towards Igari, and they were eventually changed over to the next frequency, Lumpur Radar, on 132.6. This was going to be the controller looking after them until they reached Igari and the FIR boundary towards Vietnam.
370, contact Lumpur Radar 1326, good night. Alright, 1326 Malaysian 370.
The captain read back this handover more or less exactly as he should by confirming the new frequency and giving his call sign, again sounding completely normal. When he called up the new area controller, he was told that they could continue their climb to flight level 250, which he also read back, and only 3 minutes later they received further clearance to climb to the requested cruise level, flight level 350. As Flight 370 progressed up towards the northeast, they were still fully visible on radar for all involved ATC units, and here it's probably a good time to start explaining a bit about radars in general. There are two different types of radar to keep in mind for this episode. Primary radar, which is also referred to as raw radar, and secondary radar. Under normal circumstances, commercial air traffic always uses both of them, but the secondary radar is what gives the majority of the information. It is dependent on a small radio transmitter known as a transponder on board the aircraft, and this transponder will be identified by a 4-letter numerical code with numbers from 0 to 7. Remember, that was the code that the first officer received earlier as part of the departure clearance. Now there are two transponders on board the aircraft.
Wait, it only goes to 7.
Aircraft. The active one will, when it's activated by the pilots, send air traffic control loads of information like position, altitude, speed, and even MCP selection.
Post. So I had to do that.
Cases. The transponders also communicates with other traffic and therefore enables TCAS maneuvering, and it's these transponders that makes apps like Flight Radar 24 work, since anyone can pick up the ADS-B signals that they transmit. But the key thing to remember here is that the transponders are on board the aircraft, and without them functioning, secondary radar will not work, and neither will those websites or TCAS. And this brings us to the primary radar, which is an invention that has been with us for a very long time by now. In its essence, it works on a simple idea of sending out a radio pulse and then measuring any waves that might hit a target and then bounce back to the receiver. The direction those returning waves are then coming from will give a bearing towards the target. Obviously, this technology has become much more refined since it was first invented, making it much more complex, but you get the general idea.
Yeah.
This type of radar can be used to see things that are not transmitting any information voluntarily, and is therefore often used by the military. But given the nature of shortwave radio signals, this type of radar has a quite limited range and cannot accurately track altitude and speed very well, something that will become important soon. At 1 minute and 14 seconds past 1 in the morning, the captain of Malaysian Flight 370 called up the Lumper area controller to advise him that they were now level at flight level 350.
370, maintaining level 350.
Malaysian 370.
This was acknowledged by the controller, but this was not a necessary call to make by the captain. It was more of a courtesy thing, but you could still hear from the sound of his voice that he was relaxed when he made this call, from the way that his intonation kind of dropped towards the end.
370, maintaining level 350.
And it's from here on that I have a feeling that we can see the first indication of something being slightly out of order. Now, I want to make it absolutely clear that nothing in the final report has highlighted that whatever happened.
Not gonna lie, I don't think they should have called it semi-final report. It's if we don't actually know, like the official thing, like we don't know exactly what happened yet. Again, speculation right now.
Started as early as here, but I personally reacted to something that was just briefly mentioned in the report. You see, about 7 minutes after the captain called in that they were level at flight level 350, he called up again and reported the very same thing.
370 maintaining level 350.
In the report, this was highlighted as anomalous, but the experts didn't think that it was worth paying any attention to, but I disagree. You see, we pilots tend to make these extra calls for two different reasons. The first is
Bye, Keegan.
that we have just simply forgotten about it and therefore call again just to be on the safe side. But like I said earlier, this was not a mandatory call to make. The other reason we do it is because we've been away from the frequency for a while. Maybe because we have been fiddling with the radios or turned down the volume or something else. And we just want to make
Wait, you can turn on the volume of the radio? That's interesting.
sure that ATC hasn't tried to call us while we were gone. You see, if we make that call again and ATC just responds, Roger, or something similar, well then we know that they haven't been trying to call us, because if they would have, they would now repeat any other messages that they had previously tried to send. So with that in mind, there were 7 minutes between the first call and the second call, which means that something might have happened to take the captain away from the radio between those calls. The other thing that I reacted to was the tone of voice of the captain when he made that second call.
370 maintaining level 350.
Again, the experts in the report said that they couldn't detect any stress in the voice from the recordings, but what I am hearing is a clear difference in pitch between the first and the second call. In the first, the captain sounds relaxed with a clear dropping intonation towards the end, and in the second, he just sounds busy, like he's working on something.
Yeah, well, like, yo, don't disturb me. I'm playing Minecraft on the plane.
Something at the same time that he's making that call.
370 maintaining level 350. 370 maintaining level 350.
This, the sound of workload, is something that I often hear in the simulator as well as when I'm doing training in the aircraft, and that's why I reacted to it when I heard it.
Oh, so yes, this is how, like, pilots train, like, instructors train other pilots in the simulator. So they have, like, the most peak flight sim setup ever. One that I kind of want if I ever get back to Microsoft Flight Sim. Probably won't, not gonna lie. And then they have, like, instructors in this, like, little chair with these bunch of monitors, like, monitoring pretty much everything that the pilots in training are doing.
Anyway, as expected, the controller just responded with
Malaysian 370.
Now, this doesn't have to mean anything, and I don't want to speculate any further on this detail, but I thought it was worth to highlight given what's soon about to happen. So the aircraft continued its cleared track up towards Igari, and within minutes of that last call from the captain, the ACARS sent out its last complete routine message via SATCOM down to the ground station. After this, there will be a complete silence from the aircraft SATCOM for almost 1 hour and 17 minutes. This detail is super important because it tells us a lot about what likely happened in the cockpit, but I'll get back to that soon. At time 01:19 and 24 seconds, the Lumpur area controller instructed Malaysian Airlines Flight 370 to contact Ho Chi Minh Control on frequency 120.9.
Malaysian 370, contact Ho Chi Minh 120.9. Right.
This happened about 1 minute before the aircraft flew past Igari, so they were still technically in Malaysian airspace, but would soon pass into Vietnam. And this is where the very last radio transmission occurred from Flight 370, with the captain simply answering,
Good night, Malaysian 370.
Yo, it's kind of ominous.
Now, for some people, that might have sounded like an ominous farewell, but what I heard was once again someone who was busy. So busy, in fact, that he didn't complete the readback.
Yeah, you didn't say, like, the frequency or anything like
correctly.
that.
Like I mentioned before, all frequencies we are given must always be read back to avoid mistakes, but that was not done in this call. In any case, now things started happening very quickly. 5 seconds after the aircraft flew past Igari, the Mode S functionality of the transponder, that was the part that gives that extra information, was suddenly switched off. Now the only way to switch off only that is to turn the transponder knob in the cockpit from TA-RA to the altitude off position.
Okay, what did you do and fly with?
A technical malfunction would have removed all signals completely and immediately, but in this case it took another 37 seconds for the secondary radar return to completely disappear, and as it did, the aircraft abruptly stopped following the planned route. We know this because the primary radar recorded the turn, and what it registered was that after the initial right turn towards a point called BTOD, the aircraft now started a sharp, almost 180-degree left turn instead. Now, Boeing tried to replicate this turn in the simulator, but weren't able to match up the turn and the timings perfectly. The only simulation that got close included a manually flown turn, meaning that the autopilot must have been disconnected.
Oh.
And why is that, you might ask? Well, the autopilot will only allow certain bank angles, and this turn was so tight that a much steeper bank must have been used at least partially throughout the turn in order to accomplish it. The only reasonable conclusion that can be drawn from this is that someone had now started interfering with the flight's trajectory on purpose. The timing and position of where all of this took place also looks far from random. Igari was the point just before the FIR boundary between Malaysia and Vietnam, which meant that the controller from a new country would now be taking over the responsibility for the flight. The Malaysian controller, which formally still had the responsibility, had handed the aircraft over and therefore probably didn't monitor it too closely. And the new Ho Chi Minh controller would likely wait until the aircraft called him up before starting to pay much attention to it, which is also exactly what now happened. Given this, it was the perfect place to initiate this maneuver if the intention was to try to avoid detection. And now you might ask, why disengage the autopilot? Why not just complete the turn? Well, just to the north of Igari, Thailand has something known as an Air Defense Identification Zone, which on a high-level chart shows up as 2 dotted parallel purple lines. As the name suggests, the Thai military would be monitoring any traffic entering into that zone and follow it up unless it was properly identified, had a working transponder, and followed a filed flight plan. By carefully avoiding that zone, whoever was now in control would also avoid any direct scrutiny from the Thai military, and given the direction the aircraft was now turning, it's likely that anyone looking at the primary radar would assume that the aircraft was just diverting, still under Malaysian control. This turn would also position the aircraft between that Thai ADI-Z and airway Mike 765, which would avoid any opposite traffic. This shows us that whoever was now in control was likely very well versed with the airspace structure over this particular area, and that this was likely very carefully planned out.
I think that, considering that he has a home simulator, I think he's still in control, because he probably knows what he's doing.
After the U-turn was finished, the aircraft continued in a semi-straight line down towards the southwest, and a VR vehicle known as Victor Papa Golf near Penang in Malaysia. The track showed small deviations consistent with an aircraft being flown manually and not on autopilot. Now, since these radar echoes were only captured on raw radar, it was impossible to get any reliable speed or altitude data from them. It is possible that the aircraft descended slightly during this segment, maybe to gain a higher true airspeed as it was overflying Malaysia. This theory was further corroborated by the fact that a Cellcom mobile mast on the island of Penang briefly detected a mobile phone signal, which was later confirmed to have come from the first officer's phone. Those type of signals generally have a very limited vertical range, maximum around 30,000 feet and often much lower than that. But given that atmospheric conditions have huge impact on the range, it's very hard to speculate here. But Since turning off the mobile phone is a checklist item in most airlines, this could indicate that the first officer was trying to communicate here, but no call signals ever came through, and the signal was only detected for a very short while. But what is really intriguing during this segment of the flight is another system that we have already talked about a little bit, which is the SATCOM system. You see, the SATCOM sends out regular interrogations every hour if no other information is being transmitted. And when the ground-based station tried to uplink an ACARS message at time 3 minutes past 2 in the morning, it didn't receive any acknowledgement back from the aircraft SATCOM. So what does that mean then? Well, if the ACARS system was just switched off or failed, the link would still take place. It would just communicate the fact that ACARS wasn't working. And if the system was manually logged off from the cockpit, this would also be shown in that log. And because none of that happened, the most likely reason for this SATCOM loss was a power failure to the system itself. Now, this system can be powered from several different electrical buses and from most of the aircraft's redundant power sources. So this fact has led some incredibly experienced Boeing 777 pilots, whose excellent work I will be linking to in the description, by the way, to believe that whoever was in charge of the aircraft after that initial turn must have manually turned off all of those sources. This can be done by deselecting both the primary and backup generators from their buses using the buttons on the overhead panel. After that, the aircraft would react by trying to auto-start the APU in order to replace those systems, so the person in charge would then have to put the APU switch to on and then back off again to stop that auto-start from happening. If that would happen, that would then trigger the ram air turbine, the RAT, to be activated either manually or automatically, and it would start to provide electrical power for the most critical systems like primary flight displays, navigation displays and navigation equipment, but not the autopilot. Hydraulic movement of the flight controls would not be a problem since both engines were still working and providing hydraulics, so maneuvering the aircraft manually would still work perfectly fine. Now, of course, removing the primary power sources in this way would cause everything else except emergency lighting to go black in the aircraft, and it's likely that this would make things very difficult for both the crew and the passengers in the back. And while we're on the subject of the passengers and crew, I want to point out here that we really have no idea about what actually happened to them. Some theories have suggested that whoever was in charge might have depressurized the cabin in order to get everyone into their seats and keep them under control. This is possible to do by just opening the outflow valves manually whilst still keeping the air conditioning running. The fact that the air conditioning was kept running would provide heating and make it bearable in the cockpit, as it otherwise would become freezing cold almost immediately. The passenger oxygen masks would then drop in the back, but the oxygen generators in the 777 would only last for about 22 minutes or so. But the oxygen cylinder, which is providing the cockpit crew with oxygen, would last a full 27 hours in case there's only one person using it. And it had, like I mentioned before, been topped up just that very morning. This means that if the cabin was kept unpressurized without descending, the passengers would become completely incapacitated once the oxygen generator stopped working. But whoever was still in the cockpit would be able to just continue to operate just fine. The time of useful consciousness at 35,000 feet is about 1 minute, extending to a few minutes at 30,000 feet. And anyone subjected to those altitudes without supplemental oxygen would after that not be able to take any rational decisions and soon become unconscious. After that, if no oxygen would be provided, it would take another 20 minutes or so until death would occur. But like I said before, we don't know for a fact what happened, and we won't know more until the aircraft is found, which is why it is so important that we continue the search.
Yes, continue the search. Yeah.
Now, flying an aircraft at these altitudes manually, whilst possibly wearing an oxygen mask and with only rudimentary navigation available, would be quite tiring, and that's likely why the radar images were showing these small heading variations. Anyway, at this stage, the aircraft continued to be tracked by both civilian and military raw radar as it continued its way around the south of Penang, where it started turning right through the Malacca Strait. There were temporary lapses in the radar coverage, but all in all, it painted a fairly clear picture of an aircraft flying in a controlled way and not in any way random. So, why wasn't the aircraft intercepted or tracked more closely then? Well, this was due to a combination of factors and misunderstandings between different air traffic control units and the operations controllers in Malaysia Airlines headquarters. When the aircraft first disappeared from radar, it took around 20 minutes before the Ho Chi Minh controller called up the Malaysian controller to ask about where the aircraft actually was. Now, this was significantly longer than the standard 5 minutes it should take before a query is sent, but like I mentioned before, this happened at an intersection between two different countries in the middle of the night, so it's likely that the controllers were just dealing with other traffic and didn't monitor their strips too closely. When the Malaysian controller, who was still technically responsible for the flight, was made aware of the missing aircraft, he eventually contacted Malaysian Airlines, who confirmed that they could see the aircraft flying up through Cambodia. This meant that the air traffic controllers now started contacting their colleagues along the route that the aircraft was thought to be flying to see if they could get into contact with them. And this in turn meant that none of them saw the lonely, faint radar echo that was traveling southwest instead. It was later found out that the Malaysian Airlines tracking software was basing the position of the aircraft on predictions when it didn't receive any real data, and that's what had caused that initial confusion. Now, the military did see the aircraft turning left after Agari, but since it wasn't violating any new airspace, they assumed it was just a normal air turnback and didn't raise any further alarms or send anyone up to intercept. It was only later, with the help of radar playbacks, that the picture of MH370's true path became clearer. After the aircraft had turned right up towards the northwest, it looked like it was heading towards a waypoint called Vampi. The SATCOM system still had not logged on at this stage, so we can assume that the aircraft was still flying in a power-degraded state, possibly only with the ram air turbine as a power source, but even if that was the case, navigation would still not be a problem. The Victor Papa Golf VUR was still well within range, meaning that the aircraft could use raw data navigation to find Vampi, and the waypoint could also be displayed on the aircraft's navigation display, so whoever was flying could just point the nose towards it. Vampi was soon passed, and the now more and more faint radar echo continued flying up in the general direction of airway November 571, towards another waypoint called Mekar. And it's soon after the aircraft passed slightly to the south of that waypoint at times 02, 22 and 12 seconds that all conventional radar traces from this flight completely disappeared.
Oh god.
Now, there is a real possibility that there were military radars picking up signals from this aircraft for longer than this, but given the sensitivity around showing military capability or positions of mobile radars, we haven't seen any such information come forward. So this means that from this point onwards, we're now going into the unknown.
As a matter of fact, the military radars actually had the answer to where Malaysian Airlines actually is. Imagine, bro. I'm just like keeping it from us.
And with that comes speculation or hypothesis, which you all know I try to avoid on this channel. So let's instead try to stay with what we do know. In order to further track this aircraft, the investigators, scientific community and several commercial companies had to start using any data they had received in completely new ways. And a great example of this is the Inmarsat data. Inmarsat is, as the name suggests, a company providing satellite communication services, and it was through their satellites that the SATCOM system for the aircraft ACARS was operating. The signals these satellites were sending were never designed to track aircraft, but since through their satellites,
then why is it aviation up ahead, huh?
were signals exchanged with MH370, those signals could be reverse engineered to provide a crude singular position indicator every time that they appeared. The way this was done was basically by mimicking certain parts of the GPS system. You see, each GPS satellite is basically an extremely accurate timing device, and when a device on Earth, like your phone, or in this case a Boeing 777, connects to one of them, the GPS satellite transmits a quick signal, which basically says, this is where I am and this is the time right now. That signal then travels at the speed of light, which still takes a certain amount of time to arrive to your device. That time is measured to determine how far away you are from that GPS satellite, and with the satellite's position and your distance from it, we can determine that you are somewhere along the radius of a circle. Then obviously your device will connect to multiple satellites, which each one of them drawing its own circle, and where all of these circles meet, well, that's where you are. So in the case of the Inmarsat data, this same technique could basically also be used. Each time the aircraft connected to the satellite using the SATCOM system, the time its system took to respond to the satellite signals was recorded. The same happened at regular intervals when the satellite checked that the plane was still connected, and each of these connections, 7 of them in total, are the famous handshakes that were reported about basically everywhere. Every one of those handshakes could then be used to place the missing aircraft somewhere along a circle at a specific point of time. And that process of defining a circle or arc is called burst timing offset, or BTO. But this was not the only information that the Inmarsat signals could provide. Analysts could also pick up another value in the signal, something known as burst frequency offset, or BFO.
Yo.
BFO gave information that could help the investigators determine how the aircraft was moving in relation to the satellite. As its name suggests, it involved studying the actual frequencies of the signal that the satellite received and then how they differed from the expected frequencies. Think of this like the way an ambulance siren seems to change its tone as it drives towards and then past you. When it's coming towards you, the sound waves are denser, making for a higher frequency, and after it goes past you, the sound waves moves further apart, giving the tone a lower frequency. This is called the Doppler effect, or the Doppler shift, and primary radars actually also use this in the same way to determine, for example, the speed of an aircraft. Now, I am of course oversimplifying these concepts a bit here, but in the case of MH370, since these signals between the aircraft and the satellite traveled mostly vertically, the burst frequency offset, or BFO, was instead used to help investigators determine whether the aircraft was climbing or descending. Now, those of you who have been paying attention will have noticed that I have said that the SATCOM system was not working. So how could the Inmarsat analysts get any of these handshakes? Well, here's where we get to a really interesting development that happened at times 02:25 and 27 seconds. Then, all of a sudden, the previously non-responsive SATCOM system of MH370 suddenly came back to life and proceeded to start sending a logon request to the satellite. This would later be referred to as the first handshake. This happened almost exactly 1 hour after the aircraft had completed its turn after Igari, and the interesting bit is that the burst frequency offset value in this first handshake was deemed unreliable due to a quite large frequency error. And what's making that so interesting then? Well, it turns out that the quartz crystals used in the SATCOM radio transmitters needed to be kept at a constant temperature to avoid big frequency oscillations. This was achieved with the help of something known as an oven-controlled crystal oscillator, which was basically a temperature controller, and it needed time to warm up after a lengthy power interruption. So it is likely that it hadn't reached the correct temperature at this point when the first logon message was sent, hence the BFO frequency error. And this is how we know that the aircraft was likely powered down up until just prior to this point. Science is truly amazing. Now, this first handshake also lacked a valid flight and company ID, which the aircraft previously had transmitted correctly. We cannot know this for sure, but if the aircraft's power had been manually restored at this point, well, then the person in command would likely also know that the SATCOM system would soon boot up and start sending out data. So in order to stay hidden, he would have had to manually go into the multifunctional display and disable all communications through the Communications Manager page before the Satellite Communication Unit, the SDU, became fully operational. If this was done this way, this would also erase the flight and company info, which is exactly what the data also showed. So you can see, even though no data was actually sent out, with a lot of ingenuity, the signals themselves can actually tell us a lot about what was likely going on. We also know, for example, that the navigation system was working because of which antenna the SATCOM system was using when it started transmitting. Like I said, amazing. So using the Inmarsat data, we know for sure that the aircraft continued to fly long enough to allow a total of 7 handshakes, where the first and the last were logon requests sent by the aircraft itself. Like I explained before, these logon requests were most probably caused by power interruptions, where the last one was likely caused by the fuel starvation of one or possibly both engines, after the aircraft had flown for around 7 hours and 35 minutes. That last handshake came at time 08:19 Malaysian time, which corresponds quite well with the endurance of the aircraft based on the recorded fuel. Now, these handshakes occurred roughly every hour, since the system was sent to send out a ping every hour unless other SATCOM activities were initiated. 2 of the handshakes were caused by ground-based satellite calls from the Malaysian Airlines Operations Center, who reached the cockpit but was left unanswered. Even so, they reset the hourly timing of the other handshakes, and that's the reason why all of these 7 handshakes were not happening on the same hourly intervals.
Okay.
But of course, we now have a huge problem. Since the Inmarsat data was all coming from one satellite, the arcs created by these 7 handshakes created multiple possible routes that the aircraft might have flown, and therefore an enormous potential search area. Several hugely accomplished pilots and investigators have come up with very plausible scenarios on how the aircraft must have been flown after that last radar position to both align with all of those 7 handshakes and avoid detection. Almost everyone agrees that the most likely route includes a turn from the previously northwesterly course around the area of a waypoint called Nilam onto a more southwesterly course. This would bring it down past the northern tip of Indonesia, close to Banda Aceh, and sometime after that it might have chosen a southerly course straight down into the southern Indian Ocean. Now, I will link to some incredible investigative work made by Captain Patrick Blely and Jean-Luc Marchand in the description of this video, which lays out a very plausible final route. But what I really want to do now is to also look at the possibility that there actually might be more physical evidence of where this aircraft finally ended up.
Well, to keep DMing me.
All of the evidence that I've presented to you so far points to a deliberate action from someone on board, with expert knowledge of the aircraft, its systems, and the airspace it was flying through. But a question that has been nagging me is that would someone who has obviously planned this so thoroughly to avoid detection bring the aircraft out to this point and then just turn the aircraft south and wait several hours until it ran out of fuel? It feels a bit unlikely, given how active this person was during those initial parts of the maneuver, and I wouldn't be surprised if he continued to be as active until the very end. But again, this will be hard to prove without further physical evidence. And it now looks like we might possibly have just that. You see, back in 2008, an American astrophysicist by the name of Joseph Houghton Taylor Jr. started working on something called the Weak Signal Propagation Reporter Protocol, or WSPR for short. He had previously received the Nobel Prize in Physics back in 1993 for his work on pulsars, but he was also a keen amateur radio enthusiast. WSPR
Okay, let me whisper. Weak signal propagation reporter. Plans whisper. QRP quasi beacon mode. 2 minutes TX randomized TR cycle. Give message. Kilo 1 Juliet Tango. Foxtrot November 2037. 4 FSK modulation. BW equals 6 Hertz. Spot float upload to whispernet.org. About 500 stations participating per day. 2 million spots in 2008. I have no idea what most of this means.
Whisper is a protocol for low-power radio transmissions that explores how low, medium and high-frequency transmissions propagate over large distances, and Taylor designed computer software that was used to analyze these signals. When these signals move over large distances, they sometimes scatter when they hit obstacles in their path, and this causes tiny anomalies in the signal strength. This was interesting for radio amateurs because they could sometimes use those obstacles to improve overall reception. And crucially, one feature in the Whisper protocol is that the reception from thousands of these signals have been uploaded into a shared database and stored all the way back to 2008.
Damn!
Now, I want to be absolutely clear here and say that Taylor himself never designed Whisper to be used for the tracking of aircraft. Neither did he actually think that it was possible. But back in 2021, an avionics
Give us humans enough time to make anything fucking possible.
system engineer called Richard Godfrey started exploring the possibility of using the Whisper database together with algorithms to look for anomalies in several different simultaneous transmissions as a kind of poor man's primary radar. Theoretically, if you know the exact location of the transmitter and the receiver, together with the time of day and about 1 million other factors, there might be a possibility to use tiny concurring anomalies in several of these signals to track something like an aircraft. And the really cool thing is that this technology samples thousands of signals every 2 minutes, which could potentially give us much more information than we previously had. Godfrey understood this, and from 2021 until today, he and his colleagues, Dr. Hannes Coetze and Professor Simon Maskell, have been trying to analyze this database to try and find traces of MH370. And in a report released on the 31st of August 2023, they claim that they have actually done just that.
Yo.
Again, this video is not about whether this technology actually can be used this way or not, but what I find fascinating here is that it's based on verifiable stored data. So just like with DNA that couldn't be used much during the early years but has since been refined to incredible accuracy, maybe there actually is something hidden inside of these signals. This team's trace data have actually already improved significantly from their first results as their algorithms have been evolving, and this latest report tells a quite fascinating story. Initially, the Whisper data coincided nicely with the existing radar information up until just prior to Vampy, where it indicated that the aircraft made a turn to a more westerly heading. It then paralleled the assumed track on a slightly more southerly course than indicated by the raw radar, and this could be because of the inherent impreciseness of the technology, or the same from the radar, which at that point was at the very limit of its effective range. In any case, the Whisper track continued up towards the northwest, where it intercepted exactly the arc from the first Inmarsat handshake at time 02, 28 and 15 seconds. The data then indicates that the aircraft continued up towards a point known as Sanob, after which it made a left turn towards Urdam, all very close to what the other experts predicted that the aircraft must have done to continue avoiding military radars and additional scrutiny by ATC. Now, I won't go into all of the details of the route that the Whisper data indicated, but I want to highlight a few important things.
I want the nitty-gritty. Come on.
This data pointed to a track that wasn't completely straight down into the southern Indian Ocean. Instead, it showed a series of turns, each of which was pointing towards an existing waypoint, but not ever on the same airway. This corresponds nicely with an aircraft that was still being piloted, but in a planned way to avoid interfering with existing airways where a potential traffic conflict could arise. Remember, it would not be seen on TCAS, nor could whoever was flying it see other traffic. If the intention was to not be detected, this type of behavior would make perfect sense, since its ultimate destination would be very hard to predict in case it was partially being monitored. The Whisper data also suggested that the aircraft slowed down slightly during 2 different intervals of its jagged flight down towards the south, which could possibly mean step climbs. But the thing that really stood out to me was the fact that the Whisper data corresponded almost perfectly with all of the 7 Inmarsat handshake arcs, which is data that no one is really disputing. Towards the end of the flight, the Whisper position also indicated something very strange. Because it looked like the aircraft started flying in a figure 8 pattern in between the 6th and the 7th handshake, which would have been when the aircraft was predicted to be running out of fuel. The aircraft wouldn't do that by itself because the rudder compensating system in the Boeing 777 is designed to compensate for the asymmetric thrust after an engine failure. So if this pattern was actually flown, it must have been a deliberate act by whoever was in controls. Now, it is very hard to speculate on why someone would do something like that, but at this time it would have been daylight in that area and the weather was clear, so it is possible that this was done to look out for ships in the area nearby, as a reassurance that the aircraft's final resting place would not be seen. The BFO from the Inmarsat data indicated that the aircraft could have been in a very steep descent during the last log-on handshake, as high as 14,500 feet per minute. But that doesn't necessarily mean that it just dove straight into the sea. Instead, again, according to the excellent report of Captain Blely and Jean-Luc Merchand, there is a possibility that the right engine flamed out due to fuel starvation, and that this led the person in charge to start the APU and open the crossfill valve to maximize the use of the remaining fuel. The APU standpipe sits a little bit lower in the tank than the engines does, so that gives it a little bit more access to all available fuel, and the person in command could then have manually shut down the remaining engine to maximize the APU use, which would have given access to all flight controls and systems for as long as possible, and also enable the flaps to be extended, which wouldn't be possible without either one engine or the APU running. When the last Inmarsat logon was completed, it lacked information from, for example, the in-flight entertainment system, which is logical if the aircraft was being powered by only the APU, since systems like the IFE would then have been shed to prioritize more important systems. According to Captain Blely's calculations, the aircraft could have ended up either very close to the 7th arc if it was in a rapid dive, or as far as 67 nautical miles further south if the aircraft was flown to maximize its glide and touch down with flaps 30 selected.
Why?
The Whisper data showed a possible last position at time 0819 and 37 seconds, and after that there were no more correlated anomalies found. We do know that the aircraft crashed in the ocean, in or near the already searched area, because both internal and external parts of the aircraft have been found. The confirmed piece of debris comes from a flaperon from the right-hand wing, as well as multiple other components which are almost certainly coming from MH370. All of those pieces have been washed up along the coastlines of Eastern Africa and islands around by currents that can be tracked back to this general area. And given that some of the debris found comes from inside of the aircraft, it is likely that it broke up upon impact. This horrific story have already led to improvements in tracking commercial aircraft over oceans, longer life for emergency locator transmitters, and better ATC procedures for tracking aircraft. But we can't lay this to rest before the wreckage is actually found. Again, this is why I created this video. Linked below here in the description are two different theories outlining two new search areas outside of those already searched in the biggest search effort in aviation history. One of those theories are based on the skill and knowledge of two veteran 777 captains, and the other on a widely contested new application of existing radio data, but data that has been recently proven to work following flights in other areas. I am not here to judge what is right or wrong. The only thing that I want to achieve is to get the search going again for the sake of the families left behind. So here are two relatively small new areas to search. Please get the boats out there and let's get to the bottom of this literally.
Amen, brother. Yo, that is... Holy shit, my computer was getting hot. Yeah, let me DM Tim real quick, not gonna lie. Getting some other videos ready. Add that. Just want to find one more. Where is it? Come on. Wow, I got recommend my own video. 2. What the fuck? Why is there French? Actually, before we start this next one, I'm just gonna get some food real quick because I'm fucking starving.
It took just over 4 minutes for this aircraft to lose control and fall nearly 30.
Alright. Anyway, if you think 4 minutes is fast, the crash of the Concorde You know, the Concorde crash, FN 4590. That just took 1 second over 2 minutes, so 121 seconds. Exactly. That's how long that took.
38,000 feet. That's roughly the same time it takes to toast a piece of bread. What
That's
were the
insane.
crucial details that caused this accident? Stay tuned.
But we're trying to flare too much for a landing. That's water. Not a one-way. Yo, the intro is insane. I miss the Memento Pilot videos.
The crew who were going to operate Air France Flight 447 arrived in Rio de Janeiro from Paris on the 28th of May 2009. They were scheduled for a 3-day stop in Rio before the return flight back to Paris. We know very little about how they spent their time during this layover, but what is known is that the first officer, who was later going to be pilot flying of this flight, had brought his wife with him for the trip. Given that, it's unlikely that at least he spent the whole day before the flight resting, and there were indications that this might also apply to the other pilots. Flight 447 was scheduled to depart at 8 in the evening Rio time. That would be 11 o'clock at night Paris time, and that meant that the crew would have to operate through the night on the way home, with a scheduled landing time in Paris around midday on the 1st of June. This would mean that the pilots would have to operate throughout the window of circadian law, a time of night during which it's especially hard for the human body and mind to stay alert. Because of this and the fact that the flight was scheduled to last 12 hours and 45 minutes, the flight crew had been augmented with an extra pilot to allow for scheduled rest during the flight back. This meant that there were 3 pilots who were going to fly together, 1 captain and 2 first officers. The captain was 58 years old and had a total flying experience of 11,000 hours.
Okay, male at age 58, total flying experience 10,988 hours. Total flying captain on the Airbus A330, 1,747 hours.
1,700 of which was flown as a pilot in command on the Airbus A330. The first officer was 32 years old. He was the least experienced of the crew, with 3,000 hours in total and 800 on the type. He had done his type rating on the Airbus A330 and 340 in 2008, the year before the flight.
Ew, A340, get the fuck out of here.
The third pilot, which I will refer to in this video as the relief pilot, was a 37-year-old first officer. He had a total time of 6,500 hours, but he was actually the most experienced on the type, with 4,500 hours flown on it. He had flown very little during the previous 3 months before the flight because he was also working as a management pilot in Air France. Prior to operating the flight, the pilots met up and reviewed the planning documentation, including weather, flight plans and NOTAMs. The weather was fine for the departure and in Paris, but the en route weather looked a bit more complicated. Since the flight would be crossing the equator, it would also be crossing an area over the Atlantic known as the Intertropical Convergence Zone, or the ITCZ. In this zone, the easterly trade winds from the northern and southern hemisphere will converge and can force the humid air from the surface of the sea upwards. This can cause powerful thunderstorms that can reach as high as 60,000 feet, which is much higher than most aircraft can fly. This also means that the aircraft who have to fly through this zone might be subject to flying between and sometimes even through part of these storm clouds. The storms who are formed over water in the ITCZ can sometimes contain smaller water content than the storms that form over land, making them harder to see on the aircraft's weather radar, so pilots need to be very careful when navigating around them, since they could still be quite severe. The pilots likely discussed this risk of encountering these type of storms and carried a bit of extra fuel to give them the option of navigate around these storms if needed. The pilots also briefed their 9 cabin crew about the possibility of turbulence and the effect that might have on their service. Before we leave the discussion of the Intertropical Convergence Zone, we need to talk brief their...
That seeing 4 seats in the middle?
9 cabin crew about the possibility of turbulence and the effect that might have on their service. Before we leave the discussion of the Intertropical Convergence Zone, we need to talk a little bit about the types of precipitation that can be found inside of these types of thunderstorms. Most people are familiar with the heavy rain and sometimes hail that typically come out of these clouds, but as you look higher up through the clouds, things can become a bit more complicated. Because of the very strong currents inside of the cloud, water droplets can be forced upwards into very cold air and become supercooled. This means that they are still in water form, but as soon as they hit the surface of some sort, they will instantly freeze and create clear ice. Sometimes these supercooled droplets can collide with snowflakes, and when that happens, a type of soft ice crystals can be formed, which is not as hard as hail, but big enough to be heard when it hits the aircraft if you fly through it. This type of precipitation doesn't create the type of heavy airframe icing that supercold rain does, but it has significant volume and can quickly clog up and overwhelm sensors and probes on the aircraft, especially the pitot probes, which I will explain later. More than 9 different occurrences of this type of clogging happening to Air France flights had been reported during 2008 and 2009, and these reports, together with how to recognize and deal with the issues, had been published in safety bulletins circulated to all Air France pilots during the year before the accident flight. The aircraft that the pilots were going to operate was a reasonably new Airbus A330-203. It had been delivered to Air France in 2005 and was in almost perfect working order on the evening of the departure. Prior to arriving to the aircraft, the pilots ordered 70.4 tons of fuel to be loaded, and together with their cabin crew they walked out to the aircraft and started preparing it for departure. Now, it will be impossible to explain what happened on this flight without also explaining a few details about this Airbus, but also a little bit about flying in general. Pilots need a way to accurately measure the amount of air that is flowing over the wings, because that's what really determines the performance of the aircraft. To do this, they utilize a type of probe known as a pitot tube or a pitot probe. These probes are often situated along the front of the aircraft below the cockpit, and they look a little bit like gun barrels, and they have a hole in the front where the air enters and the total pressure is then measured inside of the tube. They are electrically heated, and the heating is automatic on the Airbus A330. But in order to accurately measure the airspeed, the static pressure must also be measured, so it can be deducted from the total pressure from the pitot probes. This static pressure is measured from a different device called a static port, and that static pressure is then used both for calculating the airspeed and, crucially, also the altitude of the aircraft. These different pressures are then sent to the aircraft computers called Air Data Modules or ADMs. The ADMs will calculate the correct true airspeed, but another thing that will become hugely important in this story is that the static pressure from the static port must be corrected depending on how fast the aircraft is flying. That's because the air flows over the aircraft surfaces surrounding the static port and will therefore create localized pressure differences depending on the speed. These corrections are done automatically by the ADM computers, and because airspeed and altitude are critical values, there are 3 different independent sets of probes and computers fitted to the aircraft. Now, because of the problems that Air France and other operators had reported of ice crystals clogging up the pitot probes, Airbus had started to look into the problem. A newer type of pitot probe had been found to be more effective in preventing these problems, and a maintenance bulletin had been issued suggesting an upgrade to these newer probes.
Let me guess, they didn't do it on this plane.
Air France had just started upgrading their first Airbus A330 about 1 month prior to the departure of Flight 447, and the accident aircraft was actually scheduled to have its probes changed on its arrival to Paris after the flight. But why was the change of these pitot probes just a suggested action? Why wasn't it mandatory? Well, that's because the temporary loss of airspeed due to this issue was both very rare, it only lasted for a maximum of a couple of minutes, and there was a defined procedure which the pilots were supposed to follow in case it happened. In Air France, this procedure was known as IS de tous, but I will refer to it in this story as unreliable airspeed. Because this problem had been reported several times, it had been included in the recurrent training scenario for all Air France crews during 2008 and 2009. The training had included airspeed unreliable exercises, but only at low altitude. That's because
Okay. Why is it like whenever like they have this stuff like new things and like new accident like related things like such as this, they always do it at low altitude. Why not do it at high altitude? Because that's literally stuff like this never happens at low altitude. Well, rarely, maybe, but like from the stories I've read and like heard about, it happens at high altitude. Come on, and you're wondering why the training And you're wondering why, even though you give the pilot training, they still do this shit.
It was seen as more safety critical because of the closeness to the terrain, but the performance of the aircraft was also much better than it would be at high altitude. Airspeed unreliable can be very tricky to diagnose because the failure will look different depending on what caused it and how severe it is. During the exercises that Air France crews had practiced, the autopilot did not disconnect and there were no warnings sounding in the cockpit when the failure occurred. Now, the airspeed unreliable procedure included the use of memory items, meaning safety critical items.
The memory items deal with possible system failures or other emergencies that require
that needed to be done straight away from memory of the pilots. But using them was optional depending on the situation, and that had been interpreted as only needed if the aircraft was close to the ground. Also important for this story is that none of the pilots of Flight 447 had received any recent training on how to deal with an approach to stall and recovery, especially at high altitude. The latest stall training that they had actually received was done during their type rating on the Airbus A320, which they had all done years earlier. And that initial training that they had done was all done at low altitude, in which heavy emphasis was put on the use of thrust to recover the aircraft and power it out of the stall, achieving it with minimum altitude loss. Decreasing the pitch.
Why am I CPU usage at 62%?
It was a secondary action to take. Now, this idea that the engines will have enough power to pull an aircraft out of an extreme high angle of attack is also going to become very important. Once the 216 passengers had finished boarding and the crew were ready, the pilots asked for pushback and started moving away from their gate at time 22:09 UTC, only 9 minutes behind schedule. The first officer was pilot flying and all 3 pilots were present in the cockpit as they were taxiing out. At time 22:29, the aircraft started rolling down the runway in Rio de Janeiro and performed a completely normal takeoff. They climbed away along their clear departure route, which led them up through a northeasterly course following the coastline of Brazil. At some point after passing 20,000 feet climbing, the relief pilot left the cockpit.
Oh, give me a second.
To start his scheduled rest period, which would last about 3 hours. He went back into the crew rest compartment, which consisted of 2 bunk beds just behind the cockpit, and we don't know exactly when he left the cockpit, because the cockpit voice recordings from the cockpit voice recorder doesn't start until just after midnight UTC time. In any case, the 2 remaining pilots received clearance to climb to their initial cruise altitude of flight level 350, 35,000 feet, and once they were established in cruise, they were talking to controllers from Brasilia.
Oh.
FIR, and then later they switched over to Recife control. And it was Recife control who were going to be the last ones to have radar contact with the flight, because in that control area they were largely still
Hey.
still flying over land, but once they passed into the next FIR, Atlantico, they would move away from radar coverage and instead be following oceanic traffic separation procedures. Now, flights over oceanic areas requires special training, procedures and aircraft equipment. Since the curvature of the Earth makes VHF radio communication impossible, aircraft are equipped with something called HF radios. These radios use layers in the ionosphere to bounce the signals off from and can therefore reach much further distances. As the aircraft passed an RNAV point called INTOL, the pilots checked in with Atlantico Control on one of the two HF frequencies that they had been given. The pilots then tried to log into a new system that was being tested at the time in the area called ADS-C. This system would use automatic reports sent by the aircraft itself via satellite to update the position of the aircraft to ATC, thus showing where it was even if they didn't have radar coverage. Another cool thing that this new system could do was that it would immediately send a report if an aircraft deviated from the course or altitude that it had been assigned. But unfortunately, due to a formatting error in the flight plan that had been filed, the pilots were unable to log into this new system, and therefore, as soon as the aircraft left conventional radar coverage, it would not be able to be accurately tracked anymore, something that would come to have grave consequences. The Airbus A330 is a fly-by-wire aircraft, and that means that the inputs that the pilots make on their side stick and rudders will be electronically interpreted by a computer and then sent to the hydraulic flight control actuators for execution. This type of controls comes with many benefits. For example, it makes the aircraft substantially lighter, but mainly it allows the aircraft to monitor certain safety parameters and make sure that those parameters aren't exceeded. Parameters like excessive bank and pitch angles are monitored, as well as safeguarding the maximum and minimum speeds, and a whole load of other parameters as well. Now, detractors of the system say that this lets the aircraft have the final word of the pilots, but that's not completely true. Only maneuvers which are really extreme and ultimately dangerous are blocked by the system, but the fly-by-wire system do require that the pilots who operate them really understand how they work and when those protections actually work and don't. This is true for all aircraft obviously, but it's especially true here. And why is that? Well, in order for these protections to properly work, the computers who monitor them needs to be absolutely sure that they are using correct parameters to start with. If that is not the case, the computers will back off and take away those protections simply because the computers aren't really sure what's going on. These computers receive their inputs from a lot of different sources, like the pitot probes, the static ports, the inertial reference units, angle of attack vanes, and so on. They combine all of this data into 3 air data reference units, who together form the air data inertial reference system. As long as all 3, or at least 2, of these ADRs agree with each other, the aircraft control computers are happy, and it can continue to operate in what's called normal law. Normal law means that all protections are available and that the aircraft is basically impossible to stall or put into an upset situation. But if 2 or more ADRs start sending strange information, a couple of things will quickly happen. First of all, these inconsistencies might affect the autoflight system, like the autopilot that controls the aircraft, the auto throttle governing the engines, and the flight directors who are showing the pilots how to fly. That's quite logical if you think about it. The aircraft will not try to navigate or control the aircraft if it's not sure about what's going on. It will leave that up to the pilots to figure it out. And following up on that same logic, the aircraft control computers will degrade from normal law into either alternate law 1 or alternate law 2, depending on the severity of the issues. The difference between normal law and alternate law 2, which will soon become relevant in this flight, is that the protections that the aircraft normally have regarding maximum angle of attack or stall protection will no longer be available. This would be shown by the removal of warning indicators like the barber's pole on the primary flight display, as well as yellow crosses where the limitations would normally be shown. The other difference is that the roll control of the aircraft changes. In normal law and alternate law 1, the roll inputs on the side stick will command a specific roll rate from the aircraft. If the pilot inputs a specific roll rate to be kept, the aircraft will give that and gust disturbances will be compensated for. It will basically be very stable and easy to handle. But in alternate law 2, the side stick will give direct commands to the ailerons and spoilers.
Ah, shit. Holy shit.
Yellow. I fucking get the shoes. Yes, allow.
Yo. Oh my god.
Fucking kill me now. God damn it! Ugh. It's pissing me off. This damn computer.
I can hear the fan.
Yeah, that is a fan. There you go.
Holy lord, everything is fucking lagging. My damn laptop is doing too much. Yes, I'm running everything off my laptop right now.
Of course.
Please let me do this. Come on, laptop, you can do it.